The end of World War I. Starting off, Wilson's 14 points. Before the war was even over, President Wilson presented his 14-point plan for world peace. The first 5 points became the most important for the United States. The other 9 points addressed national boundaries and also called for the creation of an international peacekeeping organization. The first 5 points were there should be no secret treaties between countries, the ocean should always be free for trade, there should be no trade taxes between countries, military should be limited as much as possible, and colonialism should be limited as much as possible. Wilson's 14-point plan was put together to, as it says, try and create world peace, to develop a situation where the entire world could exist without going to war with each other. And he thought for that to be necessary, we needed to make sure that no countries had any secret deals with each other, that the oceans were always free to be able to be sailed through no matter what country was using them, that there was not going to be any high taxes from one country to the next, that militaries would now be limited so that no one had a super huge military to able to take over anywhere else, and also that people stopped taking over countries for their own personal gain, which is colonialism. The Allies reject Wilson's plan. Wilson did not address the anger felt by the Allies as the war ended. France, Britain, and Italy were all determined to keep Germany from being able to invade another country again. Unlike the past, when leaders met to end the war, the Allies did not include Austria or Germany when deciding on the treaty. Wilson discarded 13 of his points and only managed to get his international peacekeeping organization called the League of Nations. So Wilson really underestimated how angry much of Europe was at Austria and Germany. And so his 14-point plan served no purpose for them because they didn't feel like Germany or Austria had any punishment. There was nothing to say that what you did was wrong in their minds. And so France, Britain, and Italy were all kind of like, no, we're gonna go a different route with this. And so Wilson had to get rid of most of his points except for one. The only thing they agreed on was that they would form the League of Nations, which would be a group of countries all designed to help promote peace. So let's talk about the Treaty of Versailles. The leaders of each country involved in the war gathered in the Palace of Versailles in France to negotiate the consequences of the war. The treaty created 9 new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. The treaty took 5 regions for the Ottoman Empire and gave them to France and Britain until they were ready for independence. The treaty also prohibited Germany from having an army and also required that they pay $33 billion to the Allies. So, to create this treaty, they met in a very large palace in France called Versailles, a very fancy place, and they wrote out the kind of consequences of the war. First off, it gave a ton of countries new independence. 9 new nations were all formed. 3 of these are Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. Poland's kind of the interesting one there because this is like the 3rd time they become a country. They kept getting absorbed by Russia and other places. And they're not going to be around for long before it's going to kind of happen again. The Ottoman Empire is going to shrink dramatically after this, as they're going to get most of the Middle East taken away from them and given to places like France and Britain. France and Britain were told that they're only going to hold on to these places until they're ready for independence, and then they'd let the citizens of these new colonies have their own territories. And probably the most important part of the treaty is the effects it had on Germany, which we'll go into more of these later, but some of the biggest ones was that Germany was told they could not have a military. They couldn't have an army, a navy, an air force. They could not have any of that. They could not manufacture weapons. They could not make tanks or any of that, according to the Treaty of Versailles. And on top of that, they also had to pay $33 billion to France and Britain, which was a pretty big chunk of change. And that was going to be a problem for Germany. So, the treaty's weaknesses. There were several flaws in the treaty that would end up causing more problems than benefits. First, the treaty forced Germany to take complete responsibility for World War I, although they had clearly only been partially responsible for the war. Second, Germany was completely unable to repay back the money to France and Britain that the treaty required. Third, Russia had fought on the side of the Allies in the beginning of the war, but they gained nothing from the treaty. So all of these are things that were problems with the treaty, things that were going to cause issues further down the road. First is that it really humiliated Germany. It really kind of left a bad taste in their mouth. Because remember, the war was really technically started by Austria-Hungary after Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Germany only joined in to protect their allies, just the same way that France and Britain had kind of done. And so when that happens, Germany is really kind of upset because in the treaty they were made to be, it was called the War Guilt Clause, and they were made to take total responsibility for everything that had occurred during the war. Next, they were required to pay that $33 billion, but there was no possible way they were going to be able to do it. Not only did Germany have to take all responsibility, but they had to rebuild everything in their country that had been destroyed. And bigger than that, they had lost all of their colonies. And so without the colonies, they had very much smaller economic gains. So really, they were just completely unable to pay back this debt. And so all money that they were using to go towards the debt was money that they could have used elsewhere. And the third big issue is that Russia, who had been a very important part in the beginning of World War I, but got knocked out when they had their own revolution, got nothing from this. Even though Russia had more than 4 million soldiers die and really helped a good amount in the beginning of the war, they were giving nothing in turn for their service, which kind of led the Russians to be a little upset about that. The League of Nations. Many in the United States were also not sold on Wilson's ideas for the League of Nations. Some opponents believed that the League of Nations would have too much influence on the economy and trade of the United States. Other opponents believed that the League of Nations tied us too closely with other nations, which could drag us into another war of allies. So America, which had really been trying to stay neutral for this whole time before we got involved in World War I, is now looking at this International Peacekeeping Committee, the idea that we are now going to become allies with even more countries and kind of official allies, not these kind of secret alliances. And a lot of them were kind of against that. They felt like that if we ally ourselves with all these other countries, that we won't be able to trade as freely as we would like to, because what happens if we want to trade with a country that's not in the League of Nations or that's an enemy of someone in the League of Nations? They view that as an issue because, you remember, the trade for the United States is one of our most important aspects. On the other side, other people are like, why do we want to tie ourselves to more allies when clearly that's what got us into this war in the first place? Had we not been allied with any of these other places, Germany probably wouldn't have attacked us by any means. So they saw it as just possibly being able to cause more problems than they really needed. The treaties. We already did the treaties' weakness. There we go. Wilson refuses to compromise. Wilson campaigned heavily in the United States for support for the League of Nations. When the Senate voted in November of 1919, they rejected the plan to join the League of Nations, fearing it would tie the United States too close to Europe. Wilson refused to compromise on his points and spoke repeatedly to Congress, asking them to understand the need for his alliance. The United States eventually signed a separate argument with Germany in 1921, but they never officially joined the League of Nations. When he first came up with the idea, Wilson really was hitting the United States hard, delivering tons and tons of speeches and really trying to get people on the side of this League of Nations and his other 14 points, even though they weren't really going anywhere. Unfortunately, Wilson suffered a pretty big illness and was bedridden and could barely speak for several months. After that happened, the, fuel or the energy behind this League of Nations really died off and very quickly. And so when the Senate voted, they had almost unanimous support not to join the League of Nations. Wilson, when he got better, was furious and tried again to speak to Congress numerous times, saying, you know what, we really need to join this. This was my idea. We can't back out of it. And really trying to, save face for the United States, for it was essentially their proposal. Eventually, the United States is going to sign a separate agreement with Germany, just kind of between us and them, but they're never going to officially join and become members of League of Nations. They're going to act as like unofficial overseers. Alright, and finally, the consequences of the war. There's kind of a lot here. First off, World War I had strengthened the United States military and the powers of the government. Second, social change for African Americans and women were becoming more important to our country. Third, Europe had lost much of a generation and their countries had a long road to recovery. Fourth, fascist organizations and communism were becoming more popular in Russia, Germany, Spain, and Italy. And last, the Treaty of Versailles put a huge amount of pressure and problems on Germany. So when we look at these consequences, we can easily see the huge impact that they're going to have down the road. First off, World War I created a huge military for the United States, and what's going to end up be called the military-industrial complex. This idea that we are going to have huge businesses that their entire all of their products are going to be going directly to the military. We're also going to see huge powers of the government growing, like the Espionage and Sedition Act. Because of this, we're able to start imprisoning people for speaking out against the United States government, which is a pretty big deal. Next, social change. African Americans and women are now starting to speak out against their mistreatment. Women are now going to get the right to vote soon after World War I, partly because of their contribution during the war. African Americans who fought during the war are now coming home and realizing that they're not being treated equally. And they're realizing that that's an even bigger issue than they thought. That, even though they're fighting for their country overseas in a different country, they just still don't have equal rights back home. And that's a big issue. Over in Europe, they had a big amount of problems. Much of Europe had been destroyed in bombings. They had lost, millions of people and citizens. Those were workers. Those citizens were business owners. Those citizens were really contributing to their own economies in their own countries. So without all those people, it caused Europe to have a lot of recovery. So Europe was kind of in a tricky spot. And a lot of Europeans saw their way out of these tricky situations with kind of extreme political organizations. Some of which fascism, which is going to become popular in Spain and Italy and Germany. Fascism is where you have a really, really strict form of government where they have kind of total control of what happens. That's going to rise up as the Nazi Party in Germany, and these are going to become very, very influential to these people that are trying to recover from World War I. On top of that, communism has become in full swing in Russia and also starting to eke into China a little bit as well. And the spread of communism is going to provoke a lot of international uproar. And last, specifically speaking of Germany, the Treaty of Versailles put a huge amount of pressure and problems. The Germans were upset, humiliated, they were poor, their economy was in shambles, and they had to pay back a huge amount of money that there was no way they could do. And so that together was going to put a huge amount of pressure on Germany, which is going to lead to these fascist organizations to take control. The Treaty of Versailles is almost directly responsible for making it so that Hitler's going to have the perfect climate to take power. All right, that's the end of this one. As always, if you have any questions about anything, please either come see me or send me an email. Thank you and have a great day.